organizing these meetings every year. And we couldn't, do them without him. So even though he's not on the masthead, I want to point out that he's, indispensable to making this thing happen. So, James always has something really interesting to talk about. And this year it's going to be love and authenticity, accessing a lot of Kierkegaard's ideas about love. And I'll just turn that over to James.
Thank you. So, I'll just remind everybody that this talk was really born out of my real discomfort with ethics. I really don't like it. I had a nightmare about ethics last night. And it was all about, I was in a walled city, and it could have been sort of like Hogwarts or something like that. And it was open space for a while, really cool. But then there's this huge monumental building being constructed like right in front of me, very quickly, magically, just constructed. And then so I had to alter my path and go this way. Pretty soon another building's popping up and people are flooding the area. And they're like these sort of teachers or figures of authority standing in my way, getting out of the way. I had to climb over buildings, and pretty soon the walls were being built higher and higher. And you could hardly see the sky and the sun. But the dream ended basically with me trying to escape, with this vague sense of being in trouble. And I was, on a rooftop climbing the walls, and the sky was just disappearing. And, I wasn't clear whether I was going to reach it or not. But I think part of the reason the dream, I connected it with ethics is because I think there's a lot of ethics, and certainly what we've talked about this week stretches far beyond the ethics that I want to criticize here today. But it can be very structured, and our lives can be very structured, and our actions can feel very dictated by what it seems right to do in the context of your profession, what other people say it's right to do, what your political party says it's right to say or believe, or what it's, in school, as a psychotherapist, they're all trying to get you to say, okay, now what should you do if the patient says this, what's next, what's the technique? It's all structured, dictated. If you buy into it enough, you can trick yourself into believing that you're not really making free choices at all. And so what I'm going to present today is that that there is something dangerous about certain discussions of ethics. And I think the heart of what's good about ethics has to be authenticity and love. And that requires us to do those things freely in a fashion that's not dictated by what other people think we should do. And so I drew a quote from Julius Heuscher, who I'm going to be drawing heavily on from as a secondary source for Kierkegaard. And through all of that tradition, we're going to be talking about Jesus. So he says, actions that spring from genuine neighborly love are healthier and more viable than actions based on moralistic rules or collective reforms based purely on sociologic theories. And here's a quote from the Bible. But when the Pharisees heard that he, Jesus, had silenced the Sadducees with his reply, they met together to question him again. One of them, an expert in religious law, tried to trap him with this question. And just as a refresher, Jesus was often trying to be trapped by the Pharisees, by the religious establishment, to show that he was basically being a heretic or trying to imprison him ahead of time, or imprison him before he actually was. So they try to trap him with this question: "Teacher, what is the most important commandment of the law of Moses?" Jesus replied, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, all your heart, soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And second, and equally important, is to love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law, all of the demands and commands of the prophets are based in these two and fulfilled in them." So, when I was preparing for this talk, I talked with my father, who's a lawyer, about it. And just to get sort of what's the common sense of, like, not the, as Mike's already done a great job of talking about the etymological sense of where ethics comes from, and how really it's the same question: ethical, moral. But in the common sense, and I think this was, I'll speed through this because it was sort of outlined already, that there's a distinction between, so the common sense is often that the ethical is sort of like professional ethics. It's like the psychologist's code of ethics. It's a bunch of systems of rules and principles that you have to follow. And if you don't, you'll be punished. If you're a lawyer, you'll be disbarred. If you're a psychologist, you'll be unlicensed or put on probation, something like that. So whether you call that ethics or something else, that's one way that this field is considered. Morality, in this discussion with my father, was very clearly different. It was, your personal conscience. And a lot of people may feel that they shape their conscience around religious systems of rules, like looking at the Bible or the Quran or something like that. But the problem much of the time with morality, with, say, the dark side of morality, is that it's still constructed around, there's still a fear of punishment, which is in the form of guilt. So it's constructed around right and wrong, good and bad, just and unjust, natural and unnatural, racist and not racist, progressive and conservative, Democrat, Republican, holy and unholy. Pick your principle, whatever principles you have in mind, we all have them, that are valuable to you. There is something worthy of pursuit and worthy of guilt. Ethical codes may prescribe punishments for the disobedient, external punishments, but the disobedience of moral principles inflict guilt on the on the transgressors. So however you want to divide those things up, ethics and morality, or whatever it might be, there's a way to consider ethics and morality that beget and rely upon the fear of punishment. That is their mode of operating. For the short-sighted, ethical, or moralistic person whose highest good is moral or ethical behavior, they may not see this as a problem if it gets the person to comply with their principles. But we shall see, I hope, why this should be a disturbing proposition even for them. One reason fear should be considered in any pursuit of ethics is because it engenders a false morality, which harms the individual. The fear of punishment, whether external in the form of shame or punishment from a group to which you belong, or internal in the case of guilt, does not make a person genuinely moral, although it may create a superficially moral person who behaves in accordance with the rules. Laing actually commented on this issue when describing the concept of a false self. He says, the actions of a false self usually amount to an excess of being good, never doing anything other than what one is told, never being a trouble, never asserting or even betraying any counter will of one's own. Being good is not, however, done out of any positive desire on the individual's own part to do the things that are said by others to be good, but is a negative conformity to a standard that is the other's standard and not one's own, and is prompted by the dread of what might happen if one were to be oneself in actuality. This compliance is partly, therefore, a betrayal of one's own possibilities. Thus, morality can be deeply inauthentic, a false goodness that wreaks havoc on the moral person who suffers for it. This is aligned with Freud's observation that moralistic people are more repressed. They suffer and inflict upon themselves guilt as a way of compensating for the desires they are too afraid to bring out into the light of day. The moralist with taboo sexual or aggressive desires may never acknowledge them, but instead live a more deprived life to compensate for what he has done in his own fantasies. It is worth briefly mentioning that there are other issues that arise from those who take refuge in their moral positions. In addition to being more inauthentic and repressed, the moralist is often more judgmental. When we use moral principles to be certain of our rightness, and yet there are still problems in our relationships. Think of being in a couple, you're having a fight, you become very clear, I've done the right thing with regard to my partner, but there's still a problem, there's still suffering in the relationship. Well, as long as you're clear that you're doing the right thing, it's very easy to place responsibility for the suffering, for the trouble, for the mess onto the other person. You judge them. We wash our hands in the pure, clean waters of our ethical views and thereby become less responsible. This is equally true with political groups when conversations about politics situate blame and evil cleanly and clearly with the other party. Alternatively, without ethical codes dictating clear right behavior, we are left to make our choices and deal with the outcomes, whatever they may be, never fully at refuge in guiltlessness, moral superiority, nor collapsed into a contrite, submissive, apologetic posture. Instead, we are simply left to respond without judgment. We're left responsible. Oh yeah, and this kind of reminds me of what Jesus said, let he who is without sin cast the first stone, pointing us to this constant way in which judgment is an illusion. We're never clean. The unnecessary suffering of the repressed and authentic moralistic person could be called an evil, if not a moral one, at least a tragic one. But this is not the only evil that can result from false goodness begotten by fear. Hannah Arendt's work, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil, describes her observations attending the war crime trial of a principal Holocaust organizer, Adolf Eichmann, and through observing his case, arrives at the conclusion that evil need not be monstrously sadistic or involve malicious intent from the perpetrator. Instead, it is often perpetrated by those who enjoy the self-assured position of one following all the rules, the person who has crossed all their T's and dotted all their I's. Eichmann largely considered himself a moral man, a follower even of the ethical philosophy of Immanuel Kant and his categorical imperative. He considered himself in alignment with Kantian ethical principles throughout most of the Holocaust. The defense he gave of himself during his trial of war crimes committed against humanity and the Jewish people for his role as a central figure, not only of the Holocaust, but also of the final solution, which resulted in countless deaths, was that he was doing what he thought was right by, quote, following orders and following the law. Eichmann was observed by no less than 6 psychologists who all remarked that the primary thing that was extraordinary about him was not how cruel he was, because he was not obviously so. It was instead how very ordinary and normal he was. They even reported that he exhibited no signs of mental illness or personality disorder. According to Arendt, he was not a sadistic sociopath, nor clearly even a strong anti-Semite. He was said to have nothing whatsoever personally against the Jewish people. With his family and his relations, he was seen as a kind and good to them. How then did such an apparently normal person live so guiltlessly while committing the atrocities he did? Hannah Arendt concluded that his normality had everything to do with it. His way of navigating moral decisions was about following the rules, keeping his head down, and going with the crowd regardless of how hateful they became. In other words, his ethical position could lead him to great evil because the only form of ethical responsibility he accepted was in relation to the rules. His decision, as he saw it, was to be good through compliance or bad through defiance. A consideration of the rules supplants the most natural form of responsibility imaginable, that which is embedded in relationships between people. How do we sever ourselves from this form of interpersonal responsibility? We first do it to ourselves through adopting false selves which violently suppress our own experience. After that, it is all the easier to be violent and callous with others. In this, we can say that unethical behavior is rooted in inauthenticity, which provides the foreground for an irresponsible and callous relation to others. So is the inverse true then? Does ethical behavior grow from authenticity, which provides the foreground for a responsible and potentially loving relation to others? Psychoanalyst and existential Christian writer Julius Heuscher makes this very point in a paper on Kierkegaard's conception of love and authenticity. He argues that agape love, a form of transcendental love that fosters intersubjective relatedness to all fellow human beings, is founded in authenticity. It requires what they're calling an I-thou relationship, wherein the selfhood of neither party is diminished. This is important. This is an important starting point in Kierkegaard's conception of agape love, because it should dispel from the outset any conception of the self-denying and false form of love that many Christians might espouse. You know, this self-sacrificing idea that there's of pure selflessness. I have no desires of my own. It's all about the other. This would be criticized by Heuscher and Kierkegaard. So indeed the misconception that love need to be self-effacing brings about what Heuscher and Kierkegaard call a form of kindly submission, which does not respect or tolerate genuine selfhood in oneself or the other. This submissiveness requires a certain exaltation of the other, which is founded in a sort of erotic dynamic, but fails to see the other as a self. And part of this is because what he does a little bit is he says that there are limitations to erotic love, which often involve projecting upon the other. And agape love, I think my understanding is that it's trying to get away from that or go beyond that. The seeing the other as a self is central in Heuscher's understanding of Kierkegaard's agape love, and is founded upon Christ's most important commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself. But what does that mean? To love your neighbor as yourself is understood in two ways. The first and more common understanding suggests that we love and care for ourselves implicitly. We bathe, feed, and protect ourselves. We look out for our own interests in some way or another. To the degree you do this, the command is to love and care for your neighbor in a similar way. Heuscher and Kierkegaard's take, however, varies from this in that they ask us to examine how we experience ourselves as a self, an experiencing subjectivity. Now, in this way, to love your neighbor as yourself means that we love the other as though they are also a self, just as we are. This may seem obvious, but in fact, another extremely powerful and valuable form of love, erotic love, is said to differ from this. In erotic love, we may admire, exalt, idealize, objectify, project upon, and even use the other while loving them. And different forms of love may come into erotic relationships as well. But erotic love is notoriously unstable and involves powerful desires for pleasurable intimacy with another. Agape love does not, and thus makes a sturdier foundation for ethical behavior. What does it take to cultivate agape love? First, it takes authenticity, because any configuration in which oneself in the I-thou relationship disappears through submission, domination, or mutual dependence is a lack of relationship. While these form lack of intersubjective relationship. While these forms of relationship aren't being judged and have their own value, they are based in need and lack a situation in which the self remains autonomous and able to freely commit to the other. In other words, agape love needs to be a choice to be a self with another whom you accept as a self. However, it means less to accept the other as a self if you have not accepted yourself. This is where I would suggest that we imagine this getting messier than the picturesque, enlightened, purest form of love some might imagine. Yourself, like all selves, is a mess. Accepting your experience along with your anger and envy and taboo sexual desires, regretted actions, and repressed desires and bring them forth into the world is part of a robust authenticity, which enables a fuller embrace of the other. And I think this is why it's wise that in psychoanalytic training, you're required that you go through your own extensive analysis before analyzing others, because it's about the fact that your relationship with yourself provides a foreground for your relationship with others. But it's important, I think, that this conversations on love, and I love Nietzsche's criticism of Christian morality and Christian ideas about selflessness, because he seems to criticize them as being inauthentic. But I think there is something, so what is the motivation to love, in this way? And I think it's embedded in one thing, one verse that would say it's when Jesus says it's more blessed to give than it is to receive. I would translate this also into it is more rewarding to love than it is to be loved. And I think that, in this way, it's when you do love in this way, when you, and perhaps we can talk together about what it even means to encounter the other as a self. It may sound obvious, but there is something special about it. I mean, I don't know if you, at least for me, my experience would be that I'm going about my day. I have ideas and plans, but then there are moments when it catches me, someone else's selfhood, their desire, their flash of what it might be actually like to be in their shoes, that it's not about what I want to say to them or what I'm trying to do. All of that subsides for a moment, and you can see the other person as in some way fundamentally the same as you. You don't there's a moment there of not privileging yourself over the other person. You know, and this is something Heuscher brings in, and it's important for him that in this schema, the love of God is supposed to position us in the eyes of God, which makes us all equal before God. Now, if you're an agnostic, what do you do with that? I don't think it's necessary to have God. I think you can, I think actually that there's a certain type of love that you can stumble into with somebody. And when you do that, it sort of cultivates a certain kind of faith in the rewardingness of that. It's deeply rewarding, but it's hard to describe why that is, because it's not a concrete reward. And part of Kierkegaard's work on purity, his book Purity of Heart is to will one thing, points out that in most of our relating, we're willing two things or a second thing. It's not just to love the other person, but it's to explicitly get some sort of reward, to understand something in particular, to get something from them or to say something to them, or all sorts of things. So yeah, maybe we could open it up to talk in a moment. Yeah, so I just want to end with this quote. There we go. Our quest as earthlings requires taking upon ourselves both the manifold pleasures of life and the suffering within and around us, while recognizing increasingly that the value of ourselves transcends both, coupled with the awareness of our relatedness to our neighbor. This recognition is the goal of the quest, the goal that is ever again threatened by our tendency to view pleasure as hedonists do, or suffering as pessimists do, as life's essence. In this quest, willing to be the self one is, willing the truth that arises within, and unselfish loving are paramount. They become one and the same.
Thank you, James. That was really thought-provoking. It reminded me of something that I'd read of Kierkegaard. You know, he was, like Freud, very preoccupied with, you know, fake morality, rule-based morality, which he felt was a problem with Christianity, and genuine, loving morality. And he was, you know, one of the few existential philosophers who was religious. He was, all of his writings are embedded in Christian language. But one of the comments that really caught my attention is he remarked, I have met many, many pastors in my life and gotten to know them. I have still yet to meet a Christian. So he really had a high bar for what he thought being a Christian was.
That's Kierkegaard, right?
That was Kierkegaard, yeah. Okay, any questions, comments?
I think one thing that I think would be interesting to talk about too is that Heuscher uses this formulation about having a relationship with God as somehow being motivating for loving others. But I think the motivation for love is an important one, and obviously probably most of us aren't using our relationship with God as a motivation. So I was thinking, like, you know, for those of you who feel like, you know, your ethical behavior, your loving behavior, like what is the motivation for you? Where do you think that comes from?
This is Michael. I was wondering, well, actually through the whole week, I've been wondering about why it is that people are not authentic. And it seems like such an appealing endeavor, but we have just a rampant overflow of people in America who are not authentic, at least in my opinion.
Mm.
And it's very fashionable, let's say, to be inauthentic. And I'm just wondering why, if you have any thoughts about why it is that people are so inauthentic. I know there's capitalism, I'm sure that's a part of it, but is there any other things that make it so appealing, or why is it such a problem?
Mm.
And I agree very much that authenticity and love are definitely connected.
Mm.
Although we do have, well, I don't know, I guess that raises the other question then of, we have a lot of people who say they're in love, or they love something or love someone, and that raises the question of just how authentic is that love. I've always assumed it was authentic, but it does raise the question. Anyway.
Mm. Yeah, I guess from my perspective, the thing I was highlighting, I think, is important is fear. Though there are so many different takes on authenticity. It's sort of, you could say that everyone's being authentic, just even if they're afraid and of two minds, and living in bad faith sometimes. You could say that that's authentic in some way, but I guess what I was using it for is that it has to be, I guess, to be authentic in the way I was using it is to be courageous, and that's a certain way of not giving yourself over to fear, because fear is sort of like the antithesis, or the thing that pushes back against both authenticity and love. But I think to be authentic and loving, you have to be courageous.
And courageous literally means open-hearted.
Mm.
It's not being brave. It's just opening your heart up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I was fortunate enough to know Julius.
Mm.
He embodied everything that you're talking about. And one of his favorite myths and stories, it was a folk story of the fisherman and his wife. And the fisherman goes out and he catches this big fish.
Mm.
And when he lands the fish says, "Please throw me back." And he's startled at this talking fish. He says, "If you throw me back, I'll grant you a wish." And the fisherman is so taken back, he throws the fish back in, and he goes home to his what's described in the folk tale as a piss pot, and goes back to his wife, and they're living in this piss pot. And she says, "What, you threw this fish away? Are you crazy? Go back, see if you can catch it again. And when he asks to be thrown back, tell him you want a better house." So he does that. He goes back, catches the fish, gets a better house. The wife isn't satisfied, and she wants a better and better and better house, and she wants a higher position in society, to the point where she wants to be, I think it's Pope and then Emperor. And he goes back finally to the fish, and he says, "It's not good enough. She's Pope now, but she wants to be Emperor." And he says, And the fish says, don't worry about it, go back and she'll be where she should be. And he goes back and they're back in the hovel. And Julia said, it's always been a struggle for him, precisely to your point, how to assert yourself against, in this case, the insistent wife who wants it an extension on the house. And how do you stand up to that and remain loving? And he said it was always a problem with him. It's hard enough it was hard enough to love one person, never mind to agape everybody in the world and love everybody. He found it extremely difficult just to love one person.
Yeah, it's something he said in the paper too, was that he felt he's only able to really love in this way just a handful of people.
Yeah, I think he was talking about his wife. We met his wife. Other comments?
I don't think I have a really fully formed thought here, but I've been reading this book and there was this thing that really stuck out to me in the context of what we've been talking about, where when the Jesuits first encountered some of the indigenous tribes, they were really shocked that they didn't seem to have any systems for, like they didn't really have laws and they didn't have criminals, because when if somebody murdered somebody else, for example, the sort of the punishment was something that was sort of borne by the entire tribe, because they were trying to prevent the relatives of the person who was murdered from taking revenge. And so it was seen as this shared responsibility of everybody in the tribe, instead of as a personal failing of the particular person who had committed the murder. And I was just thinking about like that in this context of trying to distribute the sort of personal shame or blame or guilt like amongst the community for when we make mistakes or fail to behave ethically or morally. And I think your example of Eichmann made me think about it as like somebody who had fully sort of sublimated his sense of personal responsibility to the group or the ideal of the group. And so that one seems sort of wrong too. But then, if we talk about like homelessness, I think we were talking about this a lot yesterday, people being sort of cast out from society and then othered, and then we no longer feel that responsibility. And it's entirely on them somehow. So it seems like there needs to be some kind of middle ground, and maybe that's because it's only really possible to feel that like agape with a few people at a time, and to have that kind of dynamic reentrant relationship with them.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I say with like the homeless people, I mean, I think Heuscher, it sounded to me like from what I've heard about Heuscher, he was maybe being modest about how he was maybe loving in that way to a handful of people, because it still sounds like something you can cultivate in an attitude that is sort of something you're cultivating all the time. But I think that the idea that we do it constantly, and that there's always this otherizing of people. But if you I think the idea is that you can always recognize that there's a falseness in that, and that it's a bit illusory, and I was trying to bring up some, say, evocative polarities when I was thinking of like the good and the bad, say even the homeless would be, we say they're crazy or irresponsible or drug addicted, it's their own fault, or something like that, and therefore dismiss or they're impossible to reach. But to or I don't know, as much as you would sometimes be so angry with the conservatives in the country, say, like they're all people like we are, and so to be able to see somebody's, humanity, the humanity that unites all of us, that we're dealing with the same human situation. And, so sort of undermining all of these categories that would bring about a judgment that severs us from other people, that interferes with the basic fundamental insight that we are all people, all different selves, experiencing subjectivities, suffering along, struggling along. There are just so many thousands of ways that we do that. I don't think we ever do. I don't think it's common for people to stop judging others, but I think talking about agape love and just the insight of us all being selves struggling along is something always to return back to. And certainly in therapy, it's like part of the whole thing. We call it getting caught in sort of a countertransference enactment, or we have countertransference, which means that we have some sort of judgment or reaction to the person, which interferes with our ability to love and understand them. So it's like recognizing that and, thinking it through. How did that happen? What's the value in understanding that judgment? And then, but also coming back to, oh, this is a person, seeing their humanity again.
Yeah, I was thinking about what you were saying earlier about Julius and the difference between erotic love and agape love. And my take on it is erotic love is very selfish love, but very passionate. And you can be very giving from that. A passionate person could give their life for someone that they feel passionate about. So because you're so identified with that person. So being selfish, you unite, with the other, and in a way your destiny is tied to theirs. But how it's different from, I think, philia, which is a step forward in being more giving, and ultimately agape, is that erotic love can also be very critical love and very mean, and vengeful, and in its extremities mad. Whereas philia is a relation with another person, a friend, that you are not critical of, that you don't make judgments about, that you are much more giving. It's less erotic. And then agape, of course, is more general. You're that way with everyone, or try to be. Try to be kind, not so mean.
It's not about how pleasing the person is to you. That's one of the.
Yeah, you just try not to be so judgmental. Just to, most of our judgments are based on what we assume we know about another person, but not really knowing that person. And how well do we really know any person?
Yeah.
Like Jesus's thing about he who hasn't sinned casts the
Mhm.
first stone. I think that speaks to that.
Mhm. And that actually, I mean, Jesus uses a lot of these things to subvert judgment. I mean, what Christians call forgiveness, Jesus, I think it seems to me like forgiveness was not some sort of effortful act of will, at least how Jesus described it. You know, he just uses all these tricks to get you to understand that your judgments are bullshit. You know, that he who is without sin cast the first stone. You condemn another person for being an adulterer, but in the Beatitudes, he's saying that, you know, anyone who's lusted after another man's wife in his own heart has committed adultery, which some Christians take to be a guilt-ridden thing, that a guilt-inspiring thing. He also says, if you've been angry without reason at your brother in your own heart, you've committed murder. So Christians sometimes use that to inspire guilt in themselves, like they are as guilty as the murderer and so on. But looking at the context of the other things Jesus said, it seems more like he's saying, just don't judge others. You're not fundamentally different. You know, that old saying there, but for the grace of God go I. All those people that you judge, you know, the seeds of those same actions and crimes and sins and so on, you know, are in you too. You know, who hasn't gotten so angry that they've fantasized about strangling someone? I mean, or like, you know, fucking someone you shouldn't. I don't know, like all sorts of things.
Yeah, I like that. It's,
or envy and stealing. Yeah.
Thank you, James. Thank you for your talk. And about your dream.
Yeah.
First, when you were talking about the walls, I was thinking about a playful thing, like Lego and Playmobil, you know, like you can construct anything and it's playful. It was not scary when you were talking. Then you said the word vague, which I understood vague, which is wave. And then I saw wave going beyond the walls. So it was, for me, a dream, playful and escape.
It was playing. I was certainly trying to escape.
Yeah. And I was thinking about the thing you said about loving your neighbor. I think when you come, people who come from a broken family, a very violent family, very aggressive to child, when the child sees someone outside the family as a loving person, if they are lucky enough, someone who really loved the child outside the family, maybe they are more willing to love their neighbor.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing that, I mean, I think this is why for Heuscher and Kierkegaard, the use of God's love is valuable to them. But I think though that when you, however you find this form of love, it's a very special form of love because it's so rewarding innately that you don't feel deprived by it. I think. I think you feel instead. You feel. I think you kind of feel loved. I mean, when you love somebody in this way, it's like their inability. You feel close with them. You feel a kinship with them. I think. I think it doesn't cause you deprivation. But for the Christians, they say, I'm able to love another because God loves me.
Yeah, I think judging people is kind of like a cat pissing in its food bowl. You know, it's you're poisoning your world
Mm.
the more you judge people. And if you want your world to be a beautiful world, you're not so judgmental. You know, you're more forgiving. And agape is like, I think, the ultimate in forgiveness.
Mhm.
You don't hold grudges.
Mhm. 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 Mm. Mm. Mhm. 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 Mm. Yes. Mhm. You know, it reminds me of C.S. Lewis's thing. He said, so you could say that the inverse of judgment would be like pride, maybe. And so C.S. Lewis was very critical of this idea of pride. And he said, being proud is sort of like looking up two pigs in a pigsty, looking up at the farmer saying, well, I'm cleaner than he is.
Well, that's the deadliest of the sins. Pride is.
Yes. Well, because it's because it begets judgment, and it makes
It
you,
all starts from that. Yeah.
and it divorces you from other people and from their perspective from God.
Look, I know we could keep going on, but it's after 1.
Mm.
So we'd better stop and break for lunch. James, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we'll be back at 4 o'clock after our break. See you then.